Wenn man heute ein Thema wie Ethik und Ästhetik
These days, if you want to discuss an issue like ethics and aesthetics, talking about what is good and what is beautiful, people look at you with skepticism and can't quite believe what they're hearing because nobody's quite sure what the one has to do with the other. What does beauty have to do with goodness? And in fact, these two ideas or concepts have a great deal to do with one another. Not only 2,500 years ago, but today as well. But to begin with, it looks quite improbable that they might have anything to do with each other. We live in a time where the eyes are in control. We are people who see. Well, the Greeks were as well, actually. You can see that if you look at sculptures by Polykleitos, a sculptor who lived before Christ. If you look at his Doryphorus outside the university in Munich, which is a beautiful male figure, slender, proportionate, and proportion was the ideal underlying beauty. It was adopted by the Renaissance as well, and I'll be saying something about that. But is it not still proportion that we had 2,500 years ago, that we use still as a benchmark for beauty? Isn't proportionate beautiful? We're a bit like the Greeks in the sense that we experience primarily through the eyes, but there's a big difference because what we talk about today as the iconic turn, the Greeks, of course, were not familiar with. That's because the Greeks didn't have access to the kind of media that made this possible. This iconic turn relates to television, cinema, in particular those two media, but also advertising. What models do whenever they offer us objects of any kind. And as for models, if you look at the appearance of these people, and almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them, are women, and their proportion is all. It would never have occurred to the Greeks to consider women as representing the ideal of the beautiful human body, but that's another subject. If you look at the models, none of them smiles. If they do, then in a mischievous sort of way. They tend to be empty, rather sad expressions. Because, of course, we don't want any wrinkles, do we? But ultimately, it's quite boring, isn't it? Is that beautiful, that boring look? I don't think so. But to go back to the ancient Greeks, these people who also experienced the world primarily through their eyes were obsessed with balanced proportion. And the Renaissance, at least 1,000 years after Polykleitos, the architects, the sculptors, sought to imitate the ideal of ancient Greece, the Greek ideal of beauty. For example, Palladio, the great Renaissance architect from Vicenza, measured temples in Rome to see how the proportions related to one another. Leonardo da Vinci, you'll all know that man in the circle, stretching out his arms and legs. That was done in order to work out the right proportions for the human body. And the human body was the core of that ideal. So there are great similarities, and we can quite rightly say that ancient Greece, the Renaissance, and our own age are very much perceived through the eye. But of course, the criteria change, and just as I said, it would never have occurred to the Greeks to exchange the male body for a female body, whereas we think of above all female bodies as beautiful. And that's often the case. There are so many things that were rejected in other cultures and are accepted in ours, and vice versa, which is a sign that there is cultural change, even in such a matter as what is beautiful. So much by way of a preamble. I was talking about models and the sad look with which they view the camera. The way in which models are consumed or worn out. They earn a lot of money and then they're too old, so they are cast aside. The way these people are used up and consumed very much recalls the way we measure beauty today. It's a kind of commodity. People pay for it. Models are well paid if they are pretty. And it's a bit similar with art. You probably would not argue if I say that beauty and art, sometimes at least, have a great deal to do with each other. Both beauty and art are subject to cultural changes. And just as there is a kind of commodity value to women's beauty these days, there was for a long time, and still is today, a commodity value to art. Works of art are sold for millions of euros or dollars. Isn't that a sign that beauty has deteriorated into a kind of superficial appearance? Surely that's not the case for art, because I can't quote a lot of witnesses, but art speaks a different language. It no longer, for a long time, has not spoken the language of beauty. Rainer Maria Rilke, great German poet, think of the Duino elegies that he wrote a piece called Testimony, or Will, Last Will, says that the benchmark for the artist is no longer the span between opposites, let's say beautiful and ugly, who, he writes, still thinks that art represents the beautiful, and that this requires an opposite. That's not necessary, he says. Art is a passion for the whole, and he says that under the influence of the First World War, that Great War, known in the UK as the Great War. And for them, indeed, the First World War did bring more losses than the Second World War, which, from a German or Russian perspective, was even more brutal, even more devastating. And as for art in and after the First World War, because so many artists died in the First World War, Franz Marc, August Macke, many others, was intensified then by the National Socialists, by the annihilation of the Jews, the Roma, and others. And Adorno asked the question whether after such devastation there could be still such a thing as aesthetics. So he, if you like, took what Rilke has said and worked on that idea. All those things that the Greeks loved, this enjoyment of beauty, seemed to be gone. He also took the idea, the view, that beauty could not be a subject for art. You need the ugly, you need negation, he said. But this isn't as entirely new as one might think, or as Adorno might have thought, because he also quotes Hegel's pupil Rosenkranz, who in 1853 wrote an aesthetics of the ugly. But Adorno says the ugly was made taboo because for a long time, and probably in all human cultures, it was used to visualize threat. And it was indeed threatening. It was bad, possibly even evil, and so it was excluded, it was ostracized. And you get ugliness in pictures. Bruegel, for example, paints peasants who can by no manner of means be described as beautiful. And this passion for the whole that Rilke talked about, we find in a slightly different form in the theory of art developed by Adorno. But that's not what I was going to talk about. I'm only mentioning it because, of course, beauty has a home in art. And I'm not going to talk here about theory of art. I just want to point out that there are cultural changes. Beauty has a home in art sometimes, but that changes. After that introduction, let me look back a little to history. The history of the relationship between the beautiful and the good, because it's a very interesting and magnificent history. And even if it looks at first as though the beautiful and the good have nothing whatsoever to do with each other, ethics and aesthetics, we will see that they do actually. and they should have something to do with each other. But if we go back to my preamble, one might tend to assume that the idea of beauty, as far as modern art testifies, has been broken, has been shattered, and that this ideal no longer exists, that we have lost it. So to do justice to the idea, let's go back to Plato, the great Greek philosopher who, for example, and above all in his dialogue Symposium, discusses this in great detail. It's an amazing story that Plato tells, or which he has Socrates and his pupils tell, but let me condense that story, boil it down to the quintessence that is important to me here. Socrates, or rather Plato through Socrates, explains the different graduations of beauty from a purely external manifestation that the eyes perceive, which relates to, it has to affect us, it has to touch us, and it has to be proportionate, right through to wisdom. It's staggered, it's a graduation, and it begins, Plato, Socrates, of course it was a male world with the beautiful young man. Pederasty was an ideal in those days in every respect, and today not everybody can understand that perhaps, but certainly the body, the proportionate body, one's own body, the body of the other young man. Then there's a second step, which is the beauty of the soul, where we can recognize the balanced proportions of the spirit, and some say that it is far more beautiful than the beauty of bodies. And then there's a third step, which is the beauty of will, and we're gradually moving towards good. You can already see we're getting towards morality. So the third step, yes, the moral. Beauty becomes proportionate morals. And then ultimately we have this striving for wisdom, where ethics and aesthetics come together. For Plato, then, beauty, to put it in simple terms, was a kind of vehicle from perception to thought. Thought in the sense of wisdom, the highest level of thought for Plato and Socrates. It's interesting that Plato doesn't begin with the ideal of beauty, but from the here and now, from perception. He doesn't simply try to abstract perception. He's simply saying, yes, don't just look at the bodies. He's not saying morally, no, don't just look at the bodies, think of the good. He's saying, no, one leads to the other, step by step. And then ultimately one can say, is not goodness also beautiful? Yes, say those who are listening. In this case, agathon, a lovely name. It actually means, his name means the good one. And he's the main partner in this conversation, at least the conversation when it touches upon beauty. There are other important figures like Alcibiades, for example, himself a beautiful young man. But I wanted to say something about this graduation, how we move from the here and now to the good. For Plato, this was a kind of development program. And in subsequent centuries, this was eagerly pursued by philosophy. Even Thomas of Aquinas, who has a much stronger link with Aristotle, went through Dionysius the Areopagite to establish that link with Plato, and he says that what is good is celebrated as what is beautiful, and he begins with the good and develops a kind of interesting theological thesis out of this, because he said that if you take what is good and what is beautiful about a thing, then basically they are the same. They are actually identical. The good and the beautiful is identical with regard to a particular theological point. And perhaps we needed to go into those theological points, but that would take us far away from our point here. The decisive thing is not so much the physical sense of proportion that we have as the first stage in Plato, but the forma of the soul, which is, the soul is the very essence of this goodness that Aquinas is talking about. And then we have to take a step forward into the more modern era and Immanuel Kant, who was familiar with some of this line of argument, but he had a quite new idea. And his idea was that rather like with Plato, what is beautiful is something that we like. It pleases us. Now, we can argue about that. Of course, some people will be pleased by this and others will be pleased by that. That was eagerly addressed in the modern era because there's a wonderful ideal touch to that. It's so beautifully subjective. The modern era loves that. But Kant would not be Kant if he had not sought to move away from this superficial idea of beauty which we find pleasing and try to discover the basis for our judgment about such things. And there is a paragraph in the Critique of Judgment in the first part, in part 1, where he talks about the critique of aesthetic judgment, where he talks quite specifically about this relationship between beauty and morality. And this is paragraph 59 of the Critique of Judgment, where he talks about, well, this is the title of this little subsection, he talks of beauty as the symbol of morality. What would symbol mean there? Because normally a symbol is quite simply a visible expression of something, a sign of something, a kind of mediating link. With Kant, of course, like all major concepts, the symbol has a very specific meaning, and he actually defines the symbol and says it is the idea of something individual, perhaps a human being or a work of art, as being adequate to an idea. If something is adequate to an idea, then it's a symbol in the true sense. For example, human beings. A human being is a symbol, what of the idea of freedom. It'd be interesting to pursue that path as well, but again, it would be a sidetrack that I don't want to go into now. But it's important that we have Kant's concept here of symbol. The thing, if you can call a human being a thing, which corresponds to the idea, which is adequate to the idea. And human beings are indeed a symbol of freedom. It is the visible configuration of an idea, because Kant says the idea of freedom is what characterizes humans. It's not about the idea of freedom here. We're talking about the symbolic link between beauty and morality. He's not talking about the good here, he talks about morality, but let's not be bothered by that at the moment. What exactly does he mean? He means that the beautiful, and it's rather similar to what Plato is saying, has a kind of instructive or introductory or guiding function towards morality. So if people's relations with one another are beautifully formed, this will lead us towards morality. He says actually that taste is the transition from the sensuous, the habitual, to moral interest. So taste, which appears to be a very individual thing, does this please me or not, should not simply be individually, but it should apply to us all. We all have, Kant says, the same ability to make judgments. That is the basic form of the way we judge the world. We have the same reflexive mental eyes, if you like. That's my expression, not Kant's. We see the world in this way, and then we make a judgment that that is beautiful and that is beautiful, and there is no difference between beautiful and ugly here, because even the ugly has a beauty to it. We're talking about being guided towards what is morally good. So what is beautiful stimulates our ability to be moral. That's the idea. He picks this up again later in the anthropology that he wrote, Anthropologia, which he delivered in lecture form. Rather like with Plato, we have this guidance function, this instructive function. And it's quite important to Kant that he says there is a common root to the aesthetic and the ethical, to the beautiful and the good. And this common root lies within our ability to judge, within our judgment. Now, of course, you don't find that in Plato. Following that historical excursion, perhaps you will be feeling even more that everything that I'm saying about Plato and Thomas of Aquinas and Kant has absolutely nothing at all to do with what we're talking about now. And I was really trying to clear the path, because I said that today, because we have a very visualizing way of addressing our lives, because of this iconic turn, we are exposed to a certain superficiality, which I think cannot be denied. And this superficiality doesn't really leave any room for moral aspects. So if you say, what do you mean by that, and what is critical about that? Well, let me simply take an example. Perhaps you, by chance, have heard that cosmetic surgery is now already being offered by parents who earn good money. It's being offered to their daughters as a school living present. I'm not making it up. Isn't that amazing? They're not children anymore, we can't say children, but young women at 18 or 19 years wish to change their body, their face, their breasts, or whatever they think isn't quite beautiful enough. And there are no small number of parents who appear to be in agreement with that if they can afford it. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that then? It's probably a great help. Well, indeed, yes. Probably, to begin with, one might say that if young people wish for this, if they are not happy with their external experience, if they don't like their nose and it can be changed, why not? They are much more likely to identify with themselves following this. So you could say, yes, okay, cosmetic surgery as a therapeutic tool to enhance self-acceptance. What's wrong with that? An awful lot is wrong with that. What is mostly wrong with that is that we people, when we decide that we always want to do what makes our life easier, if we don't accept any flaw, any defect we may have, whether in our experience, in our knowledge, in our skills, because we can always patch it up somehow. That's not the case, though. It's not. We can't. Of course, cosmetic surgery, you can do that. The surgeon just needs skill, a knife, and the right tools. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to demonize cosmetic surgery. And when it comes to helping people who have been badly wounded in war, it is extremely important. But if we people, we humans, don't learn, and cosmetic surgery is just one example, if we human beings don't learn to live with our finiteness, our defectiveness, our lack of ability, then we are limiting our own freedom, our ability to lead our lives. And that's just from an ideal perspective, an individual perspective. But there's a collective perspective on this too. There's no meaning, no understanding for others anymore, who suffer from defects because we don't have to accept defects anymore, do we? We can always purge them, we can clean them up, like with the cosmetic surgery. And then we are limiting our freedom in our relationship with ourselves and also with others. We don't have to learn how to deal with our defects. We don't have to learn how to live with our own defects and those which others may have. So our personal skill or lack of skill, our fortune or lack of fortune in life is marginalized because we can change it. And that is a devastating misunderstanding of human life. It is a form of denial which goes back to the fact that we don't have to understand ourselves or the other person. And I'm really not exaggerating if I say that that is amoral. It makes us unfree. We are no longer able to look at those antagonisms or oppositions that Adorno and Rilke talked about and learn to deal with them. We don't want life as a whole. We only want the bits we like. The beautiful bits, the superficial bits. And that is piteous. That isn't even half of what makes up our life. But this denial of things we don't think are beautiful, or of the ugly, the distorted, that affects many, many other social dimensions which one might call not beautiful. Poverty, disease. And if we don't have to understand, comprehend these things, then, good heavens, we are discarding much of our humanity. We don't need to learn to go in search of what is humanity. And that has an impact on the collective over time. Now, I don't want to exaggerate what I said about cosmetic surgery, but I do feel it is a symbol of this superficiality or this refusal to accept our human life as a totality. And here we see the link between the moral and the beautiful. It is actually an obligation that we have, a commitment we must meet if we want to do justice to life as a whole. If we accept life to the full without manipulation, then we need to deal with all aspects of the beautiful, the ugly, the good, the bad. And then this old idea of the concordance between ethics and aesthetics becomes extremely important.